Welcome to today's webinar on how to scale API development with the OpenAPI specification. So first, a little bit of the agenda. So we're talking about API development at scale using the OpenAPI specification. So we'll kick things off with a bit of an overview into the history of the OpenAPI specification and how that relates to SmartBear, where we have been involved with that. We will take a look at an introduction to OAS development and look at some of the tools, both open source and commercial, that you can use for that. Then we will take those ideas that we've been discussing and start to look at how we can scale them up, bringing in more teams, more APIs, more users, more consumers, that type of thing. And then we'll take a look at a short demo of Swagger Hub, which is one of our tools here at SmartBear, but specifically for API design and development. First of all, a quick overview of ourselves. First of all, so for anyone who maybe hasn't heard of us before, SmartBear, we are a company that provides tools to other software development and software testing teams. So regardless of industry, we've worked with organizations in a multitude of industries. I suppose for anyone who hasn't heard of any of our tools before, we're probably best known for SOAP UI, our open source API functional testing tool, or you might have heard again of, obviously as we're here, the Swagger specification and some of the Swagger open source tools as well. There's some of our more of our tools on the right hand side there, but as you can see there from those lovely numbers, we've got a lot of users. We are working in a lot of different countries and with a lot of different companies. So that's that. To give you a bit more of a detailed idea of the tools that we offer across the SDLC, this lovely slide should give you an idea of that. So right across from the design phase over to the monitoring phase. So on the design side of things, you've got the aforementioned Swagger Hub. We recently acquired HipTest, which is a useful tool for designing applications using BDD. I have a lot going on in the testing phase. SOAP UI Pro is the commercial version of that open source tool I mentioned earlier. We've got a lot of other API testing tools on the bottom half of the slide there. Then on the UI side, Test Complete would be our kind of flagship tool for functional testing of UI applications. Load Ninja is our UI performance testing tool, and then cross-browser testing lets you take all of those scripts and run them on different operating systems and different devices and that kind of thing. Right over to the monitoring side with Alert Site. So we've got a tool for every occasion.
And we don't own AWS or Docker.
No,
we do integrate with them, just in case.
You might have been surprised to find out. No, unfortunately, we don't own AWS or Docker. That's more so just an idea of different kind of deployment platforms and environments that we work with. So
exactly, the integrations we have with as well.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so introduction to OAS development.
So a brief history of the OpenAPI specification, aka or maybe previously known as Swagger specification. So in 2010, a group called Wordnik created and open sourced the Swagger specification. And what's the anecdote that's always told was what up to that point Waddle was the main type of format for your REST API specifications, and I think some smarty pants said something along the lines of, why Waddle when you can Swagger? And that's where the name came from. So the story goes, which was massively adopted between 2010 to 2015. Then in 2015, SmartBear came along and we acquired the Swagger spec and some of the core tooling that was built around that. The OpenAPI initiative was set up to help standardize API design. So there's a lot of different companies involved in that, including ourselves, Google, Crunch. You can see a couple of them over there, or 42 Crunch on the right hand side. And in 2015, Swagger was renamed to OAS, the OpenAPI specification. So the two terms are kind of, you hear them used interchangeably a lot these days. Things kind of kicked into overdrive then in 2016. Swagger Hub version 1 was released by SmartBear. So Swagger Hub, basically, the idea is that it's kind of a platform that's wrapped around some of the open source tooling that was developed in the years kind of previous. So Swagger Code Gen, Swagger UI, Swagger Editor. So these are all open source tools you can use to work on your REST APIs. So Swagger Hub kind of takes all of that functionality and builds a lot more around it in terms of collaboration, standardization, a lot of integrations, which we'll talk a little bit more about later on in the session. After that, Swagger Hub evolved to support, both individuals, teams, and at the enterprise level. So obviously, scale is one of the key words in our session this morning. So Swagger Hub is well suited to individuals, teams, and enterprises. And Swagger Hub can reach up at the moment upwards of 300,000 users. So a wide variety of organizations and industries and use cases and team sizes. So, but we're still growing. So who knows what the future will hold, Roland. So in terms of scaling with the OpenAPI specification, what does that mean? What does that mean? I was talking to someone in an organization a couple of days ago who used the term restify. They had a lot of monolithic applications and systems and APIs that they wanted to restify, which I think was a clever way of looking at it. But it's quite often the situation where teams want to take some maybe older systems, backend systems and services and put a kind of REST API layer on top of them, so they can start to be exposed as APIs. So what does that process look like using OpenAPI specification?
Absolutely, or even moving towards a design first approach with their APIs as well, where they're contract first as opposed to maybe
code first.
Yeah,
something along those lines. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, that's common or two common scenarios that Swagger Hub can help in. And probably two terms we'll use a bit and you'll hear a bit kind of when you're dealing with Swagger Hub is code first versus design first. So a code first approach would be a situation where maybe there's not a very rigid design process in place for your API development and developers might just go straight into implementation. And then after the fact, maybe OpenAPI specification assets are generated from a code base or something along those lines and then stored in something like Swagger Hub. So that would be a code first approach, whereas design first, maybe more time is spent on the writing of an API specification first, and that's used as a kind of blueprint for development teams and testing teams and deployment teams to understand what the API actually needs to look like. But yeah, so scaling with the OpenAPI specification, in phase one, you might be looking at either smaller teams, maybe slightly less mature organizations who are just starting on their API journey. Maybe individual developers are writing or generating OpenAPI definitions from existing services or code bases or something along those lines. So yeah, that phase would tend to be maybe a little bit looser or ad hoc. And obviously it's a necessary step for teams that are kind of getting on board or kind of moving towards using the OpenAPI specification across their organization. So it has to be done. Phase two then, generally more people will start to get involved, some more teams, maybe teams that are working on different services or different aspects of an organization's services. So the idea there would be that you might get to a stage where all new APIs will have to have an OpenAPI specification written for them and will have to be OAS compliant. So instead of just generating OpenAPI specifications from your existing services, any new or proposed services, excuse me, would have to comply as well. So that's usually what something like the phase two would look like. And then phase three, you might end up bringing in something more structured across your whole organization. So you're bringing new processes and new tools, such as potentially Swagger Hub, that would need to be implemented. So maybe all the teams are on board and understand their roles, and then it's time to bring in new processes and tools to support that. So in general, they would be kind of three sample phases in scaling up with the OpenAPI specification. Excuse me. So in terms of what the tool set would look like for each of those phases. So in phase one, you're looking at some of our open source libraries or some of our open source libraries or some other open source libraries and OpenAPI generators that you can use or you can add to your existing systems. And from that, you're going to generate your OpenAPI specification. So your phase one there would generally be used by teams who are still in a code first approach. So as far as I know, actually all of the tool sets there, I believe, are open source, so you can find them on GitHub in repositories, and these are the types of libraries you can add to your services, generate OpenAPI specifications from there. The idea would be then with phase two, you might be looking at slightly more, maybe more advanced tooling, but still open source. So the tools listed there are the open source Swagger tools specifically. So now more people are getting involved.
So we're talking about here phase two, just to recap, the team, 2 teams or more than 2 teams. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, no, exactly. Thanks for that. It's good to keep the context. So in terms of the open source Swagger tools, then you've got Swagger Editor, which is a visual YAML editor that you can use to actually write out the syntax of your specification. Swagger UI is then going to generate documentation from your YAML. So obviously documentation is a crucial part of API design and development. Swagger UI can help you generate that. Swagger CodeGen then is a tool that you can use to generate both client and server side code based off a YAML specification. So it's a good starting off point for the actual implementation of a YAML specification or an API. And then, excuse me, you've also got the free version of Swagger Hub, which is obviously missing some of the fully fledged team and enterprise features like standardization and domains, which would probably be more applicable to a phase 3 organization, but it can be very useful for collaboration initially anyways, and bringing in this idea of having teams and team members with different access and different reasons to be editing an API specification. So it can certainly be helpful there. And then phase 3, as you said, then would be like the professional Swagger Hub, so Swagger Hub Team or Swagger Hub Enterprise, which, as I said, has some slightly more advanced functionality like reusable components like domains. And if you're going for like an on-premise installation, there's some more customization, and you can add your own code libraries to be generated, that kind of stuff. But stuff that's going to be probably most useful once you've got maybe you've gone through something like phase 1 and phase 2 where teams are on board and they understand their roles, and then you can start looking at phase 3. Yeah,
and then various different things like SSO hooking in with Active Directory and different SMTP servers, security certificates, all that kind of admin stuff. So it'll fit into an on-prem solution as well for more enterprise level.
Yeah, absolutely. As we'll probably talk about, there's a couple of different ways you can install Swagger Hub. So there's a SaaS version, there's an on-prem version, and then you can have a cloud version within like a private cloud. So there's a couple of different models through which you can install Swagger Hub.
Okay, so let's talk about API development at scale. So what are the challenges around API development and scaling, Joe?
What are the challenges? So yeah, when you're scaling up any development effort, that's going to come with challenges. So you've got four challenges here. So challenge 1, you might have too many versions of too many specs in too many places. Challenge 2, too many people or teams involved that need to collaborate and share. Challenge 3 might be the loss of control and visibility into the API design process. And challenge 4 is how do we go and integrate our API development into an existing delivery pipeline, because Swagger Hub or any of these open source libraries or tools are never going to exist on their own. There's always going to be other tools and frameworks that teams are using. So how do we bring in a new API development tool and make that work well with what we've got in place already?
Yeah, and I think when you're talking about scaling, so if we're starting off and we're using Swagger open source tools and we're generating our API definitions and maybe hosting that documentation in Confluence or something like that with restricted access to it, you might work up to a point of a couple of definitions, a couple of versions. But when we actually start scaling that up, then the control is going to be it's going to start getting messy, and even from a source control obviously perspective and versioning perspective as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So what can we do about these, and how can we address the challenges? Maybe with something like Swagger Hub.
Dive a bit deeper into the challenges. So I was kind of looking at challenge 1 there. So too many versions, too many specs. But if we have that central hub, our single source of truth for our documentation, and that hub is going to allow our teams to work together. on the correct version or versions of our APIs. That's certainly going to help.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we usually see like that graph there on the right hand side. It's applicable in a lot of different areas of software development and software testing. But it's about the cost of resolving defects. And the idea is generally the further to the right you get, if left to right is the SDLC, then it's going to cost you more to resolve a defect. So if a defect is found by a monitoring tool, for example, it's probably been deployed to some kind of environment and will cost a little bit more to fix. But if you can find defects in the planning, design, development stage, it's going to cost a little bit less. So how this applies to API development then is if you have a repository like Swagger Hub where all of your API specifications are stored and everyone who needs to be working on them is working on them at the design phase, then hopefully it's going to be easier to spot defects or potential defects, maybe either in the specification itself. You might spot defects from like a mock version of the service that's generated from the specification. Maybe a tester who's building their functional tests using the specification might spot something that maybe doesn't make as much sense as we thought it did at the design phase. So it just makes it a little bit easier, and you increase your chances of spotting something incorrect or something that might cause problems down the line at the design phase if everybody knows, well, all the specs are going to be in Swagger Hub, and Swagger Hub is talking to our development team, it's talking to our testing team, and everybody's kind of singing off the same hymn sheet. So ideally then you spot the defects quicker, and you get more input from more different teams, so feedback becomes a lot easier as well. Challenge number 2, there's kind of connections between a lot of these challenges, but challenge number 2 is about too many people or teams involved that need to collaborate and share. So obviously if we're talking about scaling, then scaling up is going to involve more teams, more roles, more API specifications. So it can be helpful to have a commenting and feedback system at the design phase of your API process. So Swagger Hub can help with that. There's some solid collaboration functionality, and it's very easy to leave comments on a specification, for example, on a specific line, and maybe tag one of your colleagues and leave a nice passive-aggressive comment there and say, hey, maybe take a look at this. User management and access control as well. Like I said, Swagger Hub takes the open source tools and wraps this, user management functionality and access control functionality around it. So it is easy to organize teams and workflows and also manage the access different team members are going to have. So as we'll see later on, Swagger Hub has this idea of both consumers and designers. So a designer is going to have full access, be able to change specifications, publish specifications, add integrations, and all that good stuff. Whereas a consumer maybe is only going to need to be able to see the documentation and understand how it works. So that becomes easier with Swagger Hub than it might if, maybe there was no central place to manage access, or you were just using sharing your resources in like a shared drive or directory or something like that. Challenge number 3 was the loss of control and visibility into the API design process. So I think this is probably a challenge that would be more common maybe in the later stages, like we talked about phase 2 and phase 3 of the scaling process. So like standardization, and by this I mean defining API standards in one place and enforce across APIs. And like a simple example of an API standard might be something like all operations need to have at least one, 200 response, something like that. And it's just kind of like, you might think it's common sense or best practice or something like that. But, that might not be obvious to all teams or all designers. And it might be something that you want to make sure is there in all of your API specifications. So standardization really is how do you have a mechanism to make sure that you have 100 APIs in your organization and 100 specifications. How do you make sure that every operation in those 100 specifications is always going to have at least one 200 response? Swagger Hub can certainly help with that. It's quite easy to enforce standardization at an organization level, so all specs are going to meet these rules, but we'll look closer at that later on. And I mentioned earlier on a term called domains. And these domains are Swagger Hub specific, so they kind of sit on top of the OpenAPI specification, but the implementation of them it's unique to Swagger Hub as opposed to the open source tools, and they are basically just reusable assets that you can reference in multiple API specifications. So again, if you have 100 specifications and all these specs relate to APIs that are part of similar business logic, then maybe we could assume there's going to be some responses or similar parameters or similar data models used in each specification. So, wouldn't it be useful to have maybe a library of common models or common responses or common parameters that you can tell your teams, okay, if you need to use this type of response, just refer to this domain. And then that in your 100 specifications, this response is always going to look the same. So again, this is kind of, maybe it would be of more interest to a team that are maybe in like the later phases of the kind of the scaling process. But it can be very, very useful, especially when you're talking about tens or hundreds of specifications that are being worked on by many different teams.
So just on the standardization side of things, there's things like camel case and uppercase.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, there's that's as in...
I'm trying to remember the second one. There's camel case and...
Oh, there's camel case and...
It's not, it's something...
No, it is something else. It's gone out of my head.
Yeah, just there's a question.
Surely, someone will be able to help us out with this. What's the other naming convention for parameters? There's camel case and...
Yeah, so there's the question coming through here. Is there a way to do custom rules for standardization? i.e. we want to enforce kebab case.
Kebab case.
And there's also snake case is one.
I've opened the floodgates here. Yeah. I'm going to hear a lot of naming conventions I've never heard of.
So yeah, there's a couple of ways of enforcing. I know camel case, and there's one other one as well. But anyway, we'll find it for the end of it.
Oh, that's called kebab case, with the dashes in the middle. Oh, because it's like the thing going through the kebab meat.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that's what. Oh, that's very clever. Excellent.
So the custom rules and standardization, you can't really do anything at the moment. We've introduced so that you can add branding and your logo to your documentation page. So if you're exposing documentation to consumers, it'll look like it's nice, branded, shiny, and colorful with your badges and things like that. With standardization, that's kind of come through quite a lot from customers kind of saying, can we add our own business rules, our own standardization rules? I know they're working on it. I don't think it's the easiest thing to do is to build something that's going to meet everyone's requirements, because different companies are going to have different business rules and different standardization rules. But they're going to try and do something, and they're working on it at the moment. At the moment, the standardization rules are pretty much just out of the box. So
exactly, yeah. I think what the product team are thinking about is, what types of standards are common to specific industries. So if you're in banking, you might need to meet these rules. If you're in aviation, you might need to meet these rules, and then to have these as plugins that you could use in Swagger Hub. So it wouldn't be full customization. So maybe not kebab case yet, but it's definitely something that we're hearing a lot about and we'll hopefully see in the tool at some stage in the future.
Exactly. So if you're working in building APIs for the insurance industry, there's probably standards. So if we can, plug in some sort of a cartridge or rule system into Swagger Hub that will set that standardization for you for those APIs across the various industries, then that could be something useful.
Yeah. And there was one more challenge.
Yes,
I believe.
Absolutely. Okay, so
integrating your API development into an existing delivery pipeline. So this is kind of what we talked about earlier. Swagger Hub is rarely, if ever, implemented. It's always going to be implemented in a situation where there's other tools in play, whether it's source control, a CI server, a management platform, a gateway, something like that. It becomes very useful when it starts to work with other tools in your delivery pipeline. So the good news is that's certainly part of Swagger Hub. There's a lot of integrations with the likes of GitLab, Apogee. It's quite easy to sync it up with Jenkins or push to an API gateway. Where this benefits large-scale API development efforts is that it means, I think it's a bit of a buzzword. I'm not a big fan of the term myself, but single source of truth. So it means that all of your pipeline tools and systems are all referencing a specification, for example, or referencing the generated code files from a specification. So it would give teams confidence that, in terms of API development and design anyway, everyone is working off the same, the same set of rules or the same components.
Yeah, like Swagger Hub is going to be the location where all your documentation is, your single source of truth, Joe, for your documentation.
SSOT.
But if we're generating code and pushing that to repositories, that's where everything's going to be updated.
That is it. So I think with the challenges covered, and if anybody wants to be so kind as to enlighten us as to what snake case is a question that's going to come up. Actually, hang on, Ronan, while you get set up, I can... camel case was the other one I was trying to think of. Snake case is the practice of writing compound words or phrases in which the elements are separated with an underscore. Okay? Yeah. Mauricio, on the ball. Camel case, Pascal case, snake case, and kebab case. John Dunn, straight in. Nice one. Unfortunately, we have no prizes for all the smart people who understand the naming conventions, but this has been very helpful, especially kebab case. I'm hungry now.
Yeah, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I'm just going to do a quick overview so you guys can just have a quick look at Swagger Hub if you haven't seen it before. Once I finish, we're going to launch a little poll if you want to set up a more detailed discussion or sit and have a chat with us, some of the product team, some of the engineering team about your current API strategy and find out a bit more about Swagger Hub. We can certainly do that. But I'm just going to touch on a few things very kind of high level at the moment. For the next kind of 10 minutes, talk a little bit about some of the integrations, how do we set up our teams and projects, enable standardization, and how do we integrate with existing tools as well. Just a general overview of Swagger Hub. So, and then hopefully we can remember to launch that poll, Joe, before we close up shop for the day.
Absolutely.
Oh no, we're only starting. We're just closing up shop. Bit of work to do yet today. Okay, and there's my lovely desktop, and hopefully you can see my hub.
Yes.
Yeah.
Confirmed.
Okay. Perfect.
Can see your hub.
All right. So this is the SaaS version I'm on of Swagger Hub, and these are all the APIs that I am working with or in some way associated with. Okay. I have an organization on the left called SmartBear RT Incorporated. And I also have an organization called SE Design as well. SE Design is something that I've been invited to collaborate on. So this is an organization that's owned by someone else, but maybe I'm invited as an architect or a business analyst to oversee or review specifications, maybe add comments so developers can see them, or some other role like that. But essentially, when we set up in Swagger Hub, in my little wheel settings icon over here, I can set up my organizations. So you can see that I have my own organization that we talked about, and then I have an assigned organization as well. Now, as I mentioned, for that assigned organization, maybe I'm just a consumer. Maybe I've been invited to view the documentation because I'm consuming some of those APIs in my applications and systems, and I want to understand how they work. And with regard to my organization here, and you have to forgive me, sometimes I hop into Swagger Hub and it's changed, or there's a button has moved or functionality has changed. There's a very fast release cycle with Swagger Hub, so there's new features being added all the time. Actually, this screen looks a little bit different here as well. I think standardization was here. Anyway, I'm going to go into my organization over here and we'll see how we get on. There we go. And as you can see, this is my SmartBear RT Incorporated. Here's my details. Then what I can do is I can set up my members. So I could set up my members, my developers who have, edit rights. They can fork APIs, work on them together with other developers, merge, compare and merge those changes back together, create a new API version, for example. And you can see then I could set up teams. So I could have my QA team, my development team. I may have an architect team. And this is, this is how we control access at the moment. Later on in the year, probably Q4, we have role-based access control coming in. And this is going to kind of take Swagger Hub to a whole new level. So for example, I may have a test organization, a UAT, a pre-production, a production organization. And individuals may have different rights depending on the organization they're in. So I think with role-based access control, it's just going to take this level of user management to the next level as well.
Mm-hmm.
As you can see, standardization here as well. So in standardization, I can go in and actually talk about, so as Joe was mentioning earlier on, there it is, Joe. Operation must have at least some sort of 200 response.
It's almost like I intentionally referenced it.
So you can see that we can enable standardization for an organization. And what we could do then is we could say, right, unless our developers are complying to all these standardization rules, then we're not going to let them publish their APIs.
Not this time.
No. Rules are there for a reason. So,
exactly.
But you can see here we can add certain API information. Operations must be present, and a little bit of information about models. Docs and branding. I'm not really going to talk much about this. It's actually it was a feature that was requested by so many companies. Can we put our logo on our documentation? Can we change the color of the page to make it look like it's us?
Yeah. Well, it's pretty important to, like, say, a lot of API providers, if you want to call them, like that, their users or developers that are using their services are going to have like a consistent experience. So that, like, if an organization has a development portal and then a dev is working around in there and then clicks on API documentation, and all of a sudden they're seeing Swagger Hub, it can kind of take them out of the experience. So a logo and a different color can make all the difference sometimes. Sorry guys, there's a little bit of construction going on in the Galway office at the moment, so if you're hearing like drills and chatter, it's not in your head.
We're moving from one floor to 2 floors, so that's why we're going to cut this a little bit shorter than usual today, but we are going to launch that poll. Actually, I'm just going to launch it now so that... No, we won't. We'll do it at the end. Let's keep going here for a minute. So basically my organization set up my user management access. If I go into SE Design here, just going to show you something really quickly. These are APIs. This is obviously not my organization, but I've been invited to collaborate on. As you can see, there's standardization failures here. So we will flag whenever these APIs aren't adhering to the standards that have been set. And if we want, as I mentioned before, we can enforce that you're not able to publish APIs. And what I mean by publish APIs is publish them to your own private Swagger Hub instance, right? So within your own organization, you're not publishing these out to the public domain. Although you could, the likelihood is that you're going to publish them within your own private Swagger Hub account. Now, if I did want to share certain APIs with certain stakeholders, so say for example I'm a big insurance company and I want to expose certain services to intermediaries and brokers so they can consume those APIs and do different things, then what I can do is I can create something like a new project. And within that project, I can select the APIs and domains I want to share, invite the members, and then finish. That means that I'm going to get something like this test folder here. So if I send Joe, for example, a number of APIs that he can work with, when he logs into Swagger Hub, he will see something like this, right? The 3 APIs that I shared with him. And I can control then that, when Joe goes in and looks at this pizza store API, that he is going to see documentation and documentation only, right? He's not interested in the YAML, so we can control that.
All this talk of kebabs and pizzas.
I know.
I'm getting peckish.
Yeah. So just to kind of show you where we are here at the moment as well. And I'm not going to use this one. I'm going to go back for a second. Okay. This is my pet store here. I have some sort of a syntax error below. So this is going to check for any errors with relation to OpenAPI version that I'm working with. And it's also going to show our standardization errors as well. So we'll be working on this kind of area here to show syntax standardization errors and things like that as well, just so we can kind of filter them a little bit. But essentially here you can see we have some quick links. So for example, if I wanted to look at get pet by ID and look at that particular method, I can click it, it'll take me right down to it. It'll open the documentation here for me, right? So it's quite useful, easy to use. Get rid of that. So if you look at this get pet by ID here, right, there's a try it out button. So there's an integration, many integrations actually, but one of the integrations with Swagger Hub is called API auto mocking. And API auto mocking will basically create a mock of my API from my specification and we'll host it for you. Right, it's pretty cool, but it allows me then to actually try it out. So, you know, if I'm a UI developer and I'm consuming this API, and I could say, okay, I want to pull in some information about a pet store into my, I don't know, whatever application I'm using that may consume a pet store. But anyway, beside the point, I can put in a value for a pet ID, execute it, so send a request, get a sample response back. So as you can see here, I have some JSON response or some various different sample responses here. So this is really useful. Those responses are static, right? So it's just creating a mock. We could take this API from design stage and actually create a dynamic virtual API from it in Service V, which is another SmartBear tool, but that's an entirely other conversation as well.
It's a very different story.
So you have auto mocking here, but there is the ability to create virtual services as well, dynamic services that have logic built into them as well. The advantage of that is you have something available now from a design as opposed to waiting, you know, days or weeks till that API is actually developed and ready. Just on the integration side of things, so API auto mocking, we're going to host that mock in the cloud, let you access it. There's various different integrations with your gateways. So if you want to push your endpoint or do different configuration with AWS or Apogee, you can certainly do that. And then with regard to source control, we have integrations with different source control tools as well. So if you want to automatically push your JSON or YAML API definition to source control every time you save it, we can certainly do that and set up that configuration as well. And there's also Yes, just on the versioning side of things, so you can see that, you know, I can create multiple versions. Each version will have separate documentation or specific documentation related to it. And, you know, we can push and create and store different versions of our APIs, okay, as we would with our software. So you can see here I can publish an API. I can change the API to a default, for example. I can compare versions. So for example, if I've taken a version that Joe was working on and I start you know, building out some new methods, and then we can do a compare and merge and create a new version of that, right? So and obviously it'll be down to the API owner in this case, right? Okay, and there's only one other thing I really want to show you, so I just want to keep this pretty high level today. Here's the APIs I'm working with. We talked about being invited to collaborate, by creating projects to share with teams, using that user management layer to create our different layers of management. One thing maybe I didn't show was the commenting. So for example, maybe I want to go in and I'm looking at a particular line of code here. So to line 10 and I go, Joe, please update this. Okay, add a comment. And then obviously Joe's going to pick up on that comment here. You can see we have any resolved comments we might have set up. But Joe could come in here then and say this is resolved. Okay, One other thing I just wanted to show you here. So if we open this up, the ability to create new domains. So as Joe mentioned earlier on in the presentation, domains are reusable components and they can be referenced from APIs. So, when I heard of it first, immediately took me back to years ago when I used to do a little bit of coding in college. And I went, oh, this is like a function, isn't it? It's like one of those things that I can just reuse. It's built already and I can call it in various different places. And that's pretty much what it is. Domains can have versions as well. So we can have multiple versions of domains. And of course, we can obviously, very useful to reuse components to speed up that development lifecycle. One other thing here, just the import and document API. So if you have existing APIs, you can import them once they're in JSON or YAML format, right, and pull them into Swagger Hub then and generate documentation for them automatically. That's pretty cool as well. But it'll just, I suppose, help to, if you're moving to design first approach, it'll help with maybe existing APIs as well that you can try and get them into Swagger Hub and have that central repository for your documentation. Okay, so I'm just going to launch a poll. Are you interested in scheduling a personalized session? If you are, just let us know. If you're not, we're not going to hassle you. We just like to talk to you if you're interested in learning a bit more. Certainly happy to help, so don't be shy. Joe, any other questions coming through there?
Yeah, just answering a few of them here now.
Just with regard to the questions coming through, there's some stuff, guys, we're going to have to do a little bit of research on, or just maybe talk to the product team on. But please be assured that we will respond to you. So, for example, I know there's a little bit of talk about some of the integrations and stuff. Just to kind of let you know, there is an API that sits on top of all of this. So, there's a registry API with certain functionality.
So I see there's a question coming in there about installing Swagger Hub on Kubernetes. So at the moment, it's not really possible. The on-premise Swagger Hub is shipped as a VM, so you'd need AWS, VMware, or VirtualBox to install it. So there isn't a container image of Swagger Hub that we ship at the moment. But let me send on.
So I'm just showing you as well, there's a registry API for Swagger Hub. It has some operations. So if you want to, from a automation perspective, interact with certain APIs and pull them into pipelines and things like that, there's some functions available that may be useful here. This has been added to quite a lot. So there you go. For example, retrieving the Swagger definition for the specified API and version. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, so aside from that, guys, that pretty much is all from us. So thanks a million for joining us. I hope you found this to be a useful session. So I know just from talking to a couple of people in the chat there's a bit of follow-up that we'll be doing after the session. And like we said at the start of the recording, we'll be with you in about 24 hours max. So Ronan, thanks a million for the demonstration and for answering the questions. And thanks everyone for joining. So enjoy the rest of the day wherever you are.
We'll end before the hammering the walls start coming in here.
Yeah, exactly. That's our cue.
Finish it before the walls come in.
Yeah.
That was the aim, Joe. I think we've got it. Thanks very much for the questions. Thanks for all the help and have a great rest of the week.